Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. Today we're going to talk about what they call a Civil War novel. It's called Hallam's War, and it's written by Elisabeth Payne Rosen and published now in paperback. Last year it was in hardcover, published now in paperback by Berkeley Books. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
You know, in reading this book, and it's a very long one, I kept thinking to myself, what research? What research? Was there a lot of research? I mean, you started writing this book when you were living in London, which I don't think I even want to know the reason for that. But it seems to be there must have been a hell of a lot of research. How many? Was there years and years and years? Or?
Well, there was, but I don't think of it as research because the first 3 or 4 years that I got into this, I was just a run-of-the-mill Civil War nut. So all I did was read about the Civil War. I could not read enough, and it was just fun. And then finally someone said, you really ought to put this in a book.
Oh, how interesting.
Yes.
I mean, you went all the way into slave narratives.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
mean, besides all the usual suspect like Foote and so on.
Right.
There you were reading the slave narratives. And so you have no answer to the question how many years?
I'm embarrassed to tell you it went on for so long. Well, it had a sort of
it went on for a very long
time. But I was raising 2 small children and other things intervened. But basically, and a lot of the things too that took place on the plantation, having to do with cotton farming and all, didn't have any research to do because that all was in my DNA. So
okay. Because you come from the South.
Yes. So the research part was just stuff that was clogging my head because I was fascinated with it.
No, the research part was the best kind of research. It was research begun in love.
Yes.
And that's the best.
Yes, thank you.
That's the best. And it shows. I mean, it's very interesting. Out of all that research, the number of years we don't want to know, you come up with a very interesting character, Hugh Hallam, who is, I think it's safe to say right at the start, a different kind of Southern farmer, plantation owner / gentleman. One who longs for compromise between the North and the South. Is that how you saw him?
I don't know if, yes, in a way. It's hard not to compare it to the political situation right now.
Fine.
And I would say, yes, he wants a compromise. There were many different possible compromises leading up to the Civil War. My book starts in 1859. So he had his ideas about that and hoped that things would work out. And he was a soldier by profession, had been a West Pointer and had fought as an officer in the Mexican War. So he knew something about war. And he was not so eager to go into it as many others. You know,
that whole business of the Mexican War being like not a preparation, but something that came before the Civil War is a fascinating issue historically. Because as you bring out, not in a major way, but in a minor way, the generals who are now going to be at each other's throats were comrades,
right?
You know, in that war.
I think that's one of the reasons why there's so many Civil War nuts like me, because it's so interesting. It's just so interesting.
Oh. Well, he's a Southerner with what? An enlightened view of slavery, would you say?
I do not want to think of Hugh Hallam as enlightened and liberal by modern standards. He was conservative in many ways and traditional. And I'm not at all trying in this book to give him a pass morally on the issue, for example, of slavery. He is fully complicit in the system. But having said that, I wanted to take a person who was fully enmeshed in that horrible system and see how a single, reasonable, fairly moral, good person, everyone would say he was a good person, father and husband. How could it be that a person could own slaves? And how did you live with yourself if you were a thinking person?
Well, one of his self-justifications, if you will, was his, what would you call it, his ultimate plan to release them, to give them their freedom and money.
Yes, but even that was sort of partial. You know, there were 1 or 2 that he was letting do that. But make no mistake, I think of Hugh as kind of like St. Augustine, Lord, make me pure, but not yet. It was always
soon, but
yeah,
not
it
yet.
was always going to happen once I achieve what I'm trying to achieve out here in this semi-wilderness of West Tennessee.
You kind of bring that out early on in the book when there's this slave trader comes through, and he's not really looking, but he's looking, and he looks up, and the slave meets his gaze. He met it levelly, and in that moment, Hallam saw clearly what he would never forget. Saw a man like himself, near his own age, born into the same century, in the same part of the world, a man with an inner life as private and complex as his own. And that's something I think that, bugs him throughout the book. Maybe as an ideal that he, liked to live to. And I don't know. What do you think?
I think that is the sort of turning point of the book. That's why it happens right up front.
Oh, me, oh, my. In Hallam's War, you get to know people from Tennessee and Charleston and other places down south. You get to know them very well. But you also get to meet an inquiring journalist from the north. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Hallam's War is the title of our book today. It's a novel about the Civil War, written by Elisabeth Payne Rosen, published in paperback now, by Berkeley Books. And right on the front cover, a gentleman by the name of Robert Hooks, who wrote a very, very successful popular book called The Widow of the South, says, "The American Civil War remains this nation's epic moment. Rosen's story beautifully draws us into those times." Now, that I agree with that very much, because when I got finished with this, I felt, oh my gosh, I spent a lot of time now in the Civil War and with Southerners, some of whom I like and some of whom I don't like. You really do get us deeply into the times and the issues. We need to talk about John Varick, who is very much a anti-slavery fellow from the North.
He doesn't exactly think of himself that way. He thinks of himself as a neutral journalist.
He thinks of himself as a neutral, objective journalist, and he isn't.
Yes, that's true.
In my opinion, he's not.
Well, he does come south trying really honestly to give everything a clear look and to write about the real South, whatever that was. And that's what he tries to do. But he ultimately needs a story and finds one.
Well, he also has a problem.
What's that?
I mean, the more he hangs out at Palmyra, which is Mr. Hallam's not plantation, farm.
Yes,
okay?
He prefers to call it a farm.
He has a problem. The longer he enjoys his stay and the life that he sees at Palmyra, the more he gets beyond the assumptions about North and South that he had come south with. That's the way I saw it. And he wanted to prove the validity of those assumptions. And at this point in the book, he's written nothing.
Yes. Every writer will understand that. So he's having a wonderful time. It reminds me of
enjoying the food, enjoying breakfast where the food goes on and
right.
on and on and on.
It reminds me when I was at Hollins College and we'd have these wonderful writers in residence, but they would come and it was so beautiful and it was so nice that they would spend a whole year and never write a thing. So yes, it was hard for him to get past. It was a very seductive and charming place to be if you could get over the fact that you were surrounded by slaves.
Yeah, and then when he goes to the next place, the what is that place called where McQuarter is?
Cedar Ridge.
And when he goes there, he sees a different attitude toward the slaves in that place, and this really gets him mixed up. He wants to know: is there another face to slavery, other than the beatings, the dehumanizing, making the slaves like animals? That's his question.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not sure.
Yes, and he needs some sort of breakthrough incident that will give him a story. And again, journalists and writers understand that. So he and Hugh instantly like each other when they meet each other very much and respect each other.
Yeah.
But ultimately, John Varick, in Hugh's view, takes advantage of his situation and betrays him slightly in writing the story that he writes.
Well, I think Varick's question becomes the reader's question, because you're so good at this. Who's more typical of the Southern slave owner, Hugh or Ross McCorder?
Well, hopefully, at the end of this book, you won't think there is a typical slave owner any more than there's a typical anything else. I'm again that. I'm again typical. But, that certainly is something that exists between them.
Throughout the book, the high value that the people involved in the Southern economy, if you will, owners and traders and stuff like that, the high value that they place on the slaves is very, very apparent. But
they're the most important property that they own.
Well, there's one way you put this in the book that really stings. Citizens of Nashville are willing to send their sons into the Army to fight them damn Northerners, but not willing to turn their property, their Negroes, over to help build the fortifications.
Right.
That's amazing.
Amazing, but true.
Oh.
That's a horrible thought about where people's values are.
It blew my mind, and I went back and looked at it. And it's exactly what you say in the book.
Yes,
and there they are.
In a way, it had a good result. In other words, he seems to be caring more about human life than material property, but it was a strange and ironic thing.
Okay, that's good. That's a good way. That's a good way to look at it. And things are going along okay for our friend, and he's doing his farming. He's alternating crops and all like that. But all of this is being done under the shadow of the impending war.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly, boom, it's here.
Right.
And he has to go off into it.
Yes, which he is trained to do, and which he is not entirely unwilling to do, because when you're trained to do something, you kind of want to do it.
Especially if it's soldiering.
Yes.
Because there are two parts to soldiering. One is the fighting and one is the not fighting.
Well, yeah.
And you remember the not fighting and the camaraderie and so forth.
Right, exactly.
Well, there's one very strong woman in Hallam's War, and we're going to spend some time with her when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. The book we're dealing with today is a wonderful Civil War novel called Hallam's War. The writer, Elisabeth Payne Rosen, has joined us, and it's published by Berkeley Books, and a woman by the name of Kate Furnival, who wrote a book called The Russian Concubine. And she said some nice things. It's a wonderful, sweeping epic and a captivating love story amidst a clash of ideals and armies. Rosen's intimate knowledge of the period is breathtaking. Thank you for your research. As she vividly recreates a fragile world that is teetering on the edge of extinction. Moments of intimacy and racial tension are combined with the pounding guns of history in an intelligent and moving examination of both. Now, some of the things she says in there are really, very, very impressive. This combination that she says, it's a love story amid a clash of ideals and armies. And then she uses that wonderful phrase, the pounding guns of history. So, and you do that. You do bring the war in. You bring us into the war, I should say,
yes,
in a very powerful way. and much of what happens is shaped by the war, and yet it's not a war book by any means, in my judgment.
Well,
It's much more than that.
Well, thank you for saying it's more than that, but it is a book that, my ambition was to show an entire campaign of the Civil War, even that might interest, hopefully, people who weren't ordinarily interested in following campaigns in the war.
You did that.
And it takes place, that campaign takes place west of the Appalachian Mountains in the first 2 years of the war, which has not been as written about as many other things like in Gettysburg or things that happened in Virginia. So hopefully the reader will find that even the Civil War reader who thought they'd read everything will find something new there, I hope.
I think so. I think so. Now, I believe somewhat at the center of the story of it all is Serena. That's Hugh's wife. Tell us how you think of her. You put her in the center?
I consider that Hugh and Serena are co-equal protagonists. That's the way I think of them.
Okay.
And she is a strong person, but she does live in the middle of the 19th century, not the 20th. So she's not, there are incidents where she puts up with things and accepts things that perhaps a woman 100 years later would not have. But
True.
She's equally strong. It just comes out in different ways.
Now, something happens. There are a lot of horrible things that happen in this book. One of the most horrible is the killing of one of the slaves. And I'd like you to share with us Serena's thinking after that, just that brief little paragraph.
I just have to say slightly before that Serena, like many slave owners and like Hugh, had really been looking the other way for years and just pretending that she didn't see many things that she saw.
Mm-hmm.
So this paragraph happens after something that has made her no longer able to be in denial. Serena lay on the bed where she had thrown herself after Marky left. Before any other reaction, a deep rush of grief and shame had flooded her heart when she heard the details of what Marianne had suffered. There was no denial in her now. She knew with every instinct in her body that it was true, felt in her own flesh the undeserved punishment, the helplessness, the searing pain of the whip. A white woman, some of everything her society held up as civilized and good, had descended into savagery, and all the flimsiness of the law and culture, the elaborate edifice of manners and customs they had built, was toppling around her like a house of cards. The faint, rotting smell of corruption that seemed to cling to her clothes each time she left the McWhirter's house, she recognized here in her own room.
It's really a very, very dark moment in the book, and it's brought on by someone seeking to punish somebody totally unjustly.
But you think of that as a dark moment, and it is, but it's the beginning of light. She doesn't, Serena, neither Hugh nor Serena suddenly change and become freshly washed liberals overnight, but their consciousness is raised and they begin to see things differently. This scene takes place about halfway through the book.
About halfway, yeah. Now, from that moment, Serena goes on. He's off at war, and she keeps the farm going. And it's a very, complicated operation. It's not like most of the farmers or plantation owners. They just plant cotton and pull it up and ship it out. They're doing much other stuff.
Mm-hmm. They are. And she, like, this is a part that it does seem more like a modern woman. And, of course, women felt the same then, is that once Hugh leaves and she's overwhelmed with the thought of having to take responsibility for this, but at the same time, she's loving it and she's finding she's doing it very well. And that's a really exciting time for her.
Yes, yeah. And then she drops it all because her husband is captured, and she runs off to follow him to, was it Richmond?
Yes.
And, I mean, she's incredible.
Well, many women on both sides were having to do things like that. That's what happens in war. It's not easy.
She winds up working in a hospital. And I'm sorry, you may see her as co-leading character. She is my favorite.
Ah, well, I'm glad to hear that. That's
you,
good.
You folks out there can buy the book and get your own favorite characters. I'm not going to give you any more hints. Remember, the book is Hallam's War. It's written by Elisabeth Payne Rosen. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.